Welcome, everyone. A very warm welcome to everyone who is joining us today for the seminar, Posthumanism, Dissociation, and Jungian Psychology with Glen Slater. This is a really meaningful, very meaningful experience for me, as when I was in graduate school, when I started my doctoral studies, Glen was one of my very first professors. I took Jungian psychology with him and archetypal psychology with him. And I must say, some of my most important learnings came from reading Glen's works. And it all started with this one here, the 1997 issue of the Spring Journal titled American Soul, as you can see. This is a favorite of mine. It's marked all over, and it's this with all spring journals, but this in particular has been so informative to my work. In that, Glen had an essay called Resink the Titanic. And reading that essay was such an eye-opening, in fact, profound experience for me, seeing how Glen used the depth psychological lens to really shed light on cultural complexes. Not only his writing is always eloquent, but his insights are very penetrating, whether he's talking about hubris or psychic numbing, technology, religion, gun violence. He has this very compelling way of showing the deep ties between our contemporary lives, our contemporary struggles, and their archetypal. So Glen has been a mentor and a thought partner to me now for over, I would say, a decade and a half, approaching probably 2 decades. So it's a great pleasure and honor to welcome him for the seminar today. And now I'm going to officially introduce him by reading his bio after I share that. Glen is going to present to us. During his presentation, if you have any questions, please jot them down. We're going to have a 30-minute, at least 30-minute Q&A at the end, where you can share your questions and comments with him. Now, Glen Slater, PhD, has taught for over 25 years at Pacifica Graduate Institute in California, where he is currently the Associate Chair of the Jungian and Archetypal Psychology program. He has written a number of articles and book chapters for Jungian publications, edited the 3rd volume of James Hillman's Uniform Edition Senex and Puer, and co-edited the essay collection Varieties of Mythic Experience. His research and writing interests concern Jung and film, psychology of religion, depth psychology and technology. His book, Jung versus Borg, Finding the Deeply Human in a Posthuman Age, was published just this year, early in 2024, and here it is. It's a very important and timely work. I highly recommend it. And with that, Glen, thank you for being with us. Please take it away.
Oh, well, thanks so much, Ipek. That was a really generous, kind introduction. I appreciate it, and good to be with everyone. Thanks for inviting me. So I've got a PowerPoint presentation, but I just want to do a bit more of a preamble for the first 10, 15 minutes. And that sort of sets up what I want to say. I will be sort of in broad terms talking about the themes of my book. And I wanted to focus, because of the interest of the IAJS of drilling down into certain Jungian topics, I wanted to focus on dissociation, which, in the thesis of my book, if you will, is quite pivotal. I'm essentially putting forward the argument that it's because of our dissociation from the deeply human that we're pivoting into a more of a post-human fantasy of where we're going. So we'll explore that. And I also want to focus a little bit on just our understanding of technology in general. It's such a huge theme and presence to us in the culture, and how do we find a few more specific ways to relate to that and talk about it. So that's what I'm going to focus on. And as Ipek said, we'll make sure we leave half an hour at least for question and discussion at the end. So my book, which Ipek mentioned, Jung versus Borg, Finding the Deeply Human in a Posthuman Age, it's titled in a little bit of a sort of retro sci-fi fantasy B-movie fashion, trying to be deliberately provocative. But the substance of it is that I do see a divergence occurring around what we find at the heart of Jung and what's going on in terms of where the digital age seems to be taking us. So basically, there's three areas of interest and concern that overlap in my book and in what I'll share with you today. And most broadly, and this goes back to something I discovered when I was researching Jung's basic approach to religion and going back into the origins of depth psychology, that there's a very impressive way in which in the 19th century, the emergence of the fundamental principles of understanding the unconscious were very dovetailed with the Industrial Revolution and the effects of industrialization on the psyche and the shift in lifestyle that happened then. And it's made me think for a long time now that maybe depth psychology could play a pivotal role as we move into a very different relationship with technology, which is apparently producing a very different set of symptomatology as well. So that's the first thing. And secondly, I've been interested since the early 2000s in this broad movement, cultural movement that's become very influential among leading technologists, but also some philosophers and cultural commentators, and the movement known as posthumanism. And it's become a little bit of a slippery term. So I'll talk about that a bit more as we go along. But I think it's fair to say that this has emerged as a sort of secular religion. And particularly among the Silicon Valley, Seattle technologists, there is just this acceptance that we're moving towards merging with our machines, both, and I think principally our minds having brain-computer interfaces, but our bodies also swapping out body parts for robotic parts. The view is that this will just keep increasing, and that eventually we will become cyborgs. And Borg is short for cyborg. Cyborg is short for cybernetic organism, which refers to the coming together of machines and biological organisms. So that's the second area, and it just seemed to me as I started reading about this that Jungian depth psychology should have something to say about this idea that we're totally changing the course of human evolution. And then the third area is a little more our contemporary experience. That I think the experience of many, if not most of us, is that our adaptation to information technologies and to what we might think of as a digital lifestyle has come at a considerable cost. And we all know the benefits of these technologies and the advances that have come in medicine and other areas of science because of the capacity to share data all around the world instantaneously. And we know that. But the point, I think, is that amidst all this mastery and magic, smartphones, apps, there's a corrosive effect on our well-being And it's showing up in particular areas like people's experience of isolation and loneliness, the depression and anxiety of digital natives. And, I think as depth psychologists, we start with the symptom, as it's said, and we try to pay attention to that. So they're the three areas. And my book works to draw a line between where we are with technology right now, where many astute and influential people think we're headed, and what Jung's understanding of the psyche invites us to make of all of this. Now, to sort of enter into the discussion, I do think there's a shift in perspective that's necessary. And this really concerns the way our relationship with machines has changed. It used to be that we'd think of technology in terms of the tools that we would pick up and then put down again. And in many respects, that's remains true. But with ubiquitous computing, connectivity, information sharing, and the way the internet has come to basically mediate much of what we do and much of how we understand things. That this sort of pick up and put down posture is no longer the case. So I think it's fair to say that technology now shapes our total environment, and it started to define ways of being. So because of this, I've taken to using the term the technosphere. And the first point that I really want to make is that we're immersed in this technosphere, that this is where we are already. And at the core of this is the eclipse, the eclipse of the offline world by the online world. And that effectively we've already, or functionally, we're already merged with our devices. And where we're headed appears to be a displacement of actual reality by virtual reality, a literal merger with our digital devices, which is at the core of the posthuman fantasy, and sometimes referred to as transhumanism. And then when we put our Jungian understanding beside all this, it's hard to avoid seeing that there's an increasing detachment from the depths of life, that we're becoming more prone to compartmentalized thinking, and that these fragmented states of mind, and knowing what we do about how the psyche works, that these fragmented states of mind are pretty ominous. And in fact, if we are preparing because of our power to change the nature of reality, if we're preparing to alter the whole direction of evolution, it seems to me that we better get a grasp pretty quickly on what is the psychology of this moment? What is motivating us to head in these directions, pushing us from behind, and also what are the symptomatic effects of this? Now, I often, when I'm talking to sort of broader groups, in order to kind of ground the topic, I say, particularly if we're gathered in an actual venue, now just imagine that you feel down into your pocket or you look in your pocketbook and you've left your smartphone at home. What's that like these days? Now, many of you may be already rebels, and you may have dumb phones, or you may not carry your smartphone everywhere. So it's a little different. But we can step up the scenario a little bit and say, well, imagine you've lost all connection to the internet. How does that like affect your level of just everyday being and anxiety and so forth? Someone did a very cagey social science experiment with digital natives, and they said to this group, now you have a choice. You can either lose your smartphone or you can break a bone in your hand. Which one do you choose? And the majority chose to break the bone in their hand. And the reason, their rationale was, well, at least shows how confidence in medicine. Well, while my hand is being repaired, I can still be online and connected to my friends, etc. So I think that just gives us a sense of that functional, right? The functional merger with our devices, and how we're on a slippery slope in this regard, and it's hard for us to just pull up and rise above it and try to consciously take in where we're going. There's of course the elephant in the room, one major element of the discussion I haven't named, and that's artificial intelligence, AI. And for most of us, this has only become prominent over the last couple of years with the emergence of chatbots and so forth. But it's been the focus, the primary focus of information technologists for decades. I mean, many of whom saw this coming. And you know, now AI can be used by everyone. We're familiar with displacement of workers, and if we've thought about it in any depth, we realize that maybe we're sort of outsourcing parts of our own functionality or creativity, that this is going to be one of the results. And so in terms of these themes I'm laying out, we can think of AI as the primary pivot between the human and the post-human, because that's at the center of the idea of merging with technology, that if artificial intelligence can reach the level of human intelligence, and here they talk about, for example, artificial general intelligence, that is all the rage now. Can we get artificial intelligence to have common sense, for example, and thus be able to be more human? And you know, the idea is that if that is achievable, there'll be so little difference between human and artificial intelligence that the merger will be invited, and companies already working on these brain-computer interfaces. They sometimes exist. There's now technology whereby people can just think and control the mouse on their computers and so forth. And as always, this technology is wonderful and magical for people who to restore an ability. And you know, I fully acknowledge that. But the question is this slippery slope of where one thing leads to the next. So, for example, artificial general intelligence is thought to be the stepping stone to what's sometimes referred to as artificial superintelligence. And this is the notion that AI will surpass us. And then, of course, with the way civilization is, take over. That it will start doing our thinking for us. And this argument is also behind the posthuman one, which is, well, we better just hang on and keep up for as long as we can. Sometimes this is referred to as the singularity. Writers like Ray Kurzweil have made revived this term, which goes back further, but that this is the moment where the computers surpass us in a sense, which will obviously change everything. So I think it's fair to say that the picture that's emerging from the technosphere in general, but from our turn to AI in particular, is one of putting all our eggs in the basket of computation. That this will be the primary means of navigating existence and the primary way in which the course of civilization will be shaped. And convincing arguments can be made for that. But I think if we're engaged with Jungian thought, we have to see the one-sidedness of this approach, the way in which other imperatives, other drives, other conditions for well-being, not to mention a sense of soul, that these are sort of pushed to the side by putting all our eggs in the basket of technological solutions. But as we know, it's more than that. It's not just that we will lose these faculties or qualities of life. It's that what does get split off psychologically tends to return in compulsive ways. So I'm very interested in the idea of what's going to happen between now and this merger. How or can we survive if we're going to split off the sort of instinctuality of our being? So to scoop all this up, and as I said, this is my kind of preamble, the way I begin my book is that I suggest that just as we've witnessed the disruption to our outer ecology in the industrial age, we're now on the verge of a similarly powerful disruption to our inner ecology in the digital age. But of course, as we know, the disruption of the psyche in that way has really vast implications. And in particular, I think we could say that in this sort of narrowing of our conceptions of thought and mind, the idea that of mind as computer, which has been not just influential in AI, but very influential in cognitive science and cognitive psychology, that this emphasis comes with a marginalization of other forms of intelligence, emotional, aesthetic, imaginal, and a commensurate corrosion of our capacity to generate understanding, right? Which is different to information and even knowledge, let alone to talk about, well, what would bring us into generating more wisdom? So this is the collision, and I've chosen this analogy. There are a couple of main influences for me with thinking back to Rachel Carson's watershed moment with her book Silent Spring, where she shed light on the unintended consequences of pesticide use and the way in which whole ecosystems and really this was the coming into being of ecological thinking, or at least this is one of the moments that we could point to. And the other person, I lean on Gregory Bateson's phrase, ecology of mind, that the mind also has an ecology that, and we seem to be, at least in the technosphere and among the technocrats of our age, overlooking this fact that we think this sort of rational intelligence can do it all. But no, the mind itself is an ecosystem. And we could say, what is that? Well, that's the psyche. That's our understanding of the psyche, that there's a kind of regulation of mind that happens. So this is my setup. Let me go to the screen share and go to my PowerPoint, and you can go. Hopefully everyone can see that. Put on the and there's my book. And basically what I'm putting forth here, oh, by the way, you know, I know you're probably all used to this by now, but one of my pet peeves when people do PowerPoints online is that the speaker turns into this tiny little thumbnail on the, but there's two parallel lines that you'll see, tiny little parallel lines between the participant view and the PowerPoint. You can pull them either way, so up to you, but you have that option. So I'm basically arguing that in many respects the technosphere is opposed to our ability to attend to the psyche, let's say. I'm not saying that technology and the psyche are opposed, because obviously technology, the impulse to create things, to control nature even, is part of the psyche. But in particular, the technosphere seems to be squashing this sort of more ecological view of our psychological life and the pieces that are required for that. Now, I don't think it's news to anyone that modern technology has cast quite deep, long shadows, and I would suggest that there's four main shadows of modern technology. First, going back to what I was talking about with the Industrial Revolution, the radical change to lifestyle, the disruption, both socially and psychologically, that happened then. Secondly, the military-industrial complex, the war machine, these weapons of mass destruction, you know, enabling peoples, nations, even individuals to create so much harm and death, obviously. The third shadow then would be climate disruption, the sort of late industrial age effects. But I think it's fair to say that there's a fourth shadow, and that's the shadow now being cast by the digital age. And we can think back to the mid-90s. Some of you will remember like how much optimism there was around the internet, for example, the way the internet was going to spread democracy and connect peoples all over the world and so forth. But instead, this whole shadow of tribalism and the dark web and the use of the online world for malicious purposes and so forth has emerged. So as I pointed out, we're immersed in the technosphere. Computing is now everywhere, and so on. But we seem to have lost an ability to attend to the nature of the psyche, the more instinctual needs, the enduring values, spiritual aims, meaning and purpose, sense of soul. And some of this displacement, there's a few things I lay out at the beginning of my book to underscore the one-sidedness of the technosphere, and one is the futurism, that we think everything good now is in the future, and that we're going to develop. Some of you may remember Jung's essay, The Spiritual Problem of Modern Man, where he's already pointing out how being modern means having your back to the past. And I think we understand how having your back to the past also means a disconnection from the collective unconscious. So in terms of at a cultural level. So we could say, you know, our adaptation to the online world, to these emerging digital technologies, that this is the sphere of collective consciousness, and therefore comes into a tension, at least, with the relationship with the collective unconscious. So we have the problem of one-sidedness, and we have what I think is, and what I want to go into with you, an inner division. But then the implication of that is maybe also ways in which we're possessed by the unconscious. Now, I want to just say a note here about the use of the term posthumanism, because some people have started to use this as a word that simply means going beyond the anthropocentric worldview, so that the human is not at the center of everything, which of course is an important shift in consciousness, and also going beyond the narrowly classical humanism. And I've come to think of this as a sort of soft posthumanism, and I think we can all relate to the value of that. But if you go back to the origins of the term and some of the early writings in the 70s and early 80s on the term posthuman, technological posthumanism, it's at the center of it. And I think anyone who uses this term has to wrestle with the idea that the most prominent shift on the horizon is the technological one, that this is where we think, well, we can tinker with our minds and our bodies and perhaps come up with a post-gender, for example, way of being, or we could realize that we're not as split from the animal as we like to pretend we are. But I think for the soft posthumanists, they have to think out the implications, and realize that even if we do come up with ways to change ourselves in a conducive manner, there's that capacity is equally going to apply to people who will make changes in the other direction. And of course, the hard posthumanism is what I've already described, and that is going through to the idea that, well, eventually we'll be able to leave the body behind altogether. We'll be able to download our minds into cyberspace and this kind of thing. This is the logical extrapolation. So we've entered the AI age, and as has been said throughout the modern technological era, going back to our Thoreau, we make the tools and then we become the tools of our tools. And surely this is going to be even more true when it comes to our relationship with AI. And if you want to put your finger on like what's the essential problem here? I like to think of this in terms of the algorithmic architecture of the technosphere, which of course is shifting our consciousness in different directions, even without us knowing it. And the archetypal architecture of our life experience. And in the book, I just use the term deeply human as a sort of synonym for the archetypal. So drilling down a little bit, we could say that the opposition here is between the deeply human, the idea of an ecology of mind, a psychic regulation that's rooted in the archetypal patterns of life, and the post-human, which is inevitably going to be directed and controlled by the algorithmic and the algorithms that are put in place by technological corporations to keep us engaged, to keep us online, to shape our thinking in all sorts of ways. And mostly we're unconscious of the degree to which those algorithms are already shaping our lived experience. So let's just go back to Jung and remind ourselves of some basic principles here, which are implied in what I've been saying so far. Here's a quote from 1958, where Jung's talking about consciousness in its kaleidoscopic mobility. I mean, my God, that's over 50 years ago. Think about the kind of kaleidoscopic mobility we have now. But he points out that even so, this rests, as we know, on the comparatively static or at least highly conservative foundations of the instincts and their specific forms, the archetypes. This world in the background proves to be the opponent of consciousness, which, because of its mobility, learning capacity, so he's talking about learning capacity, but just think about now the information at our fingertips, is often in danger of losing its roots. So that's sort of psychological problem. And he says, a psychological split runs through vast numbers of individuals. The cause of this development lay principally in the economic and psychological uprootedness of the industrial masses, which in turn was caused by rapid technological advance. But technology, it is obvious, is based on a specifically rationalistic differentiation of consciousness, which tends to repress all irrational psychic factors, the archetypes. Hence, there arises in the individual and nation alike an unconscious counterposition which in time grows strong enough to burst out into open conflict. And that to me is the real problem. We can talk about soul loss, people talk about being disconnected, and as we'll talk about soon, dissociated. But what happens when these parts of the psyche become more autonomous? This has always been a favorite, as you know, Jung talks about archetypes in a number of ways, but I like this particular emphasis where he says they're the hidden foundations of the conscious mind, or another comparison, the roots which the psyche has sunk not only into the earth in the narrow sense, but in the world in general. Archetypes, systems of readiness for action, same time emotions and images, they're inherited with the brain structure. Indeed, they are its psychic aspect. And I would say that even a lot of this posthumanism is ignoring the overall structure of the brain. Some of you may have dipped into, for example, Ian McGilchrist's work about his hypothesis that the emphasis on the left hemisphere in our time is sort of pushing right hemisphere processes away. I mean, there's an example of sort of splitting things off. What happens to the imagination when it's not tended to, or what happens to our capacity for pattern recognition when we think everything is about this sort of left brain intellect? But these brain structures, Jung says, represent on the one hand a very strong instinctive conservatism, while on the other they're the most effective means conceivable of instinctive adaptation. They are thus essentially the chthonic portion of the psyche, if we may use such an expression. That portion through which the psyche is attached to nature, or in which its link with the earth and the world appears at its most tangible. The psychic influence of the earth and its laws is seen most clearly in these primordial images. And we, in our question and in our discussion time, we can look at this. We can talk about, for example, if you want, Gigerish's idea that we're really leaving nature behind, that the direction of the psyche is well and truly away from these roots. But again, I say to you, well, what happens in the interim? We still have bodies, we still have emotions, we still have the imagination that are tied to the archetypes. And as we start to depart from them, they don't just go away. As we know, they go underground. You know, to get a little more specific about the archetypal world, to me, in my thinking about Jung, there's three sort of meta-archetypal patterns or imperatives. And we can think about these in relationship to technology. There's obviously first the sort of archetype of the whole, the tendency of our ecology of mind, if you will, towards inclusion and completion. There's the related idea of the religious function. You'll remember the beginning of Jung's essay, Psychology and Religion, where he strips down religion to what he thinks of as its essence. And he says it's all about paying careful attention to the forces that are impinging upon us. In other words, it's a sort of instinct for consciousness to become conscious of what is acting on us and to develop attitudes of reverence towards that, a sense of the sacred. And then thirdly, you know, we have this archetype of the shadow. And, you know, as you know from Jung, it's all about taking the shadow into account. What would be different, for example, if we were to look back over the history of modern technology and take the shadow into account and say to ourselves, well, this isn't just incidental. This isn't just human nature messing up and so forth. The very nature of technology itself generates shadows, like most other things generate shadows. But there's something in our idealism around technology, the splitting of fear and hope, I suppose, that leaves us so invested in the hope side of technology that we're not enough aware of this shadow side. Some specific technospheric displacements that then follow is obviously it's implied in much of what I've been saying that the broader patterns of life and holistic awareness start to go out the window. Particularly in terms of modes of psychological life, you know, that the idea that everything can be reduced to data, leaves behind so many modes of understanding and perception. The deeply human, or the archetypal, which goes hand in hand, I think you'd agree, with the religious function. If we're paying attention to the forces impinging upon us, we're paying attention to the gods. What does it mean to recognize or ignore the gods? And then a big one for me, a big shadow cast by the digital age, is the relationship to the past. That what Jung put his finger on in that essay, The Spiritual Problem of Modern Man, has just become more so, and that people then don't have a relationship to the ancestral and the past. So to sort of summarize the problem in a really accessible way, we can think about the collision that's going on here between the horizontal and the vertical. That the animating idea of the digital age is that we can accomplish everything by expanding our knowledge on a horizontal plane. And the internet, in a way, has provided that. It's given us this sort of expansive access, all of this data, right? But what, as I've been saying, happens to this capacity to truly understand, to put things in context, for example, or to be able to differentiate the value of different kinds of information? I mean, these things to me pertain to a vertical awareness. And if we put this in psychological terms, we just need to imagine a great tree and realize that if it's all horizontal, if there's no root system, then the tree is somehow going to topple over. And I just have to think that this is what we seem to be pushing into. The historian, some of you may know the work of Yuval Harari, and in his book Homo Deus, where he addresses a number of these themes, he talks about the new religion of dataism, right? The belief that more and more data is going to solve every problem, and that would be the horizontal. So here's where I want to dig down a little bit more into the two themes I laid out at the beginning. First of all, to think about technology itself in a different way, and then we'll go into dissociation. Sometimes when you may have noticed you're talking to people about technology, the sensibility arises, well, this is just the latest iteration, and we've always adapted. Humans have always adapted to their innovations. And I would say that the problem with that is that indeed this time is different, and it's different because of the way technology has not only become so pervasive in this technospheric sense, but it's coming into us. It's coming into our minds. Algorithms are shaping what we think about, the modes of thought we have, the kinds of consciousness we bring, and very soon, if not happening already, the way technology is literally going to come into the body and like reshape our physical relationship to the world. I think these are qualitatively like decisively different changes that make this just going with the flow and, you know, we'll keep up and deal with it, that fantasy doesn't work. And so too, the idea that technology in itself is neutral, and what changes is the way we relate to it, how we're going to use it or not. This is also a trope that enters into these conversations. And to get beyond this sensibility, I think it helps to go back to what we might argue is the archetypal root of technology itself, which is this idea the Greeks had of techne, which essentially means a crafting. But as the Greeks saw it, it was a crafting in dialogue with nature. Right? And it also wasn't split off from art. So that both art and what we would think of as being technological belonged on a kind of continuum. And this is an interesting idea because I'll come back to that in a moment. Here's a more contemporary definition of technology by Brian Arthur, which I think is very usable: the constant capturing and harnessing of natural phenomena. But notice the way in which the capturing and harnessing is also a little different from just being in a dialogue with nature. Arthur also says new technologies are constructed mentally before they're constructed physically. And I find this to be also a pivotal piece. You know, you remember that Jung, one of Jung's definition of the archetypes is that they're modes of apprehension. You know, they're often talked about as structures shaping our experience, but they're also shaping out the way we perceive things, the way we imagine into things. And, you know, here's Arthur pointing out that technology itself really begins in the mind. It begins in a way of seeing the world. So in my book, in order to honor the idea that the root of technology is a part of the psyche, I talk about it as the tinkering instinct, that there is this instinct to play with things, to change things. And the problem is when that becomes the only thing of value, or the only thing we believe is going to, you know, it becomes a form of technological solutionism, as the writer Morozov referred to it. And there are many sensibilities that then become shadowed or split off, but one of them in particular, I think we could say, is a sense of the sacred. And a book that's always impressed me in this way, some of you may be familiar with it, is Projecting the Shadow, subtitled The Cyborg Hero in American Film, by Friends and Rushing. Book that's not on a lot of people's radar, but it really puts forward the thesis that there's a sort of myth that goes very deep into the American culture and American history, where the power of technology to kind of conquer the land and to conquer its indigenous peoples, that archetypally it was a splitting of that power from the sense of the sacred, that there, you know, in traditional cultures, the impulse to change the world is always accompanied by a sort of shamanic reflection, or that one asks permission from the gods in order to take action or to go out on the hunt. And that there's something that's gone on in the American psyche in particular, split those things off, and that shamanic impulse or imperative has gone underground. And so to me, that would be what would like both restrain and properly contextualize these technological efforts, that if there was truly a sense of the sacred, and the sensibilities that go with that, a sense of sacrifice, a sense of reverence and awe and so forth, that this would perhaps mitigate. Now, the other thing in terms of the shift from the industrial to the post-industrial, we could say that, if you're to describe the shadow problem of the industrial age, it was that we turned the earth into a resource and a commodity, and then we pushed that relationship way too far. And I find Heidegger's essay, his famous essay on the problem of technology, to be very instructive in this way, because he points out that this is how modern technology and ancient technology differ, that whereas techne, as we were saying, is in conversation with nature, modern technology tends to manipulate and exploit nature, that there's this dominant instrumentality. And to me, this is the big one as to why technology is not neutral, because technology, we could say, in our modern experience of it and application of it, is always postured. There's always this posture of objectification of the world, and sometimes even of others. But his profound insight in this essay is that this commodification of the world is going to turn around onto us, and that humans will become the sort of standing reserve, that we are the resource. We're the new natural resource. Our attention, our information, our online presence. So I think we tend to carry a split in our minds between the sort of big bad, smoke billowing icons of like the industrial age, and this sort of super clean, almost invisible digital technology that's running in the background. But what we need to become conscious of is how it is turning us into a commodity. So to underscore this, just a few key ideas you might be able to follow up yourself. Herbert Simon coined the term the attention economy way back in the 1970s, because he could see the writing on the wall, the earliest signs of the information age, that this is what runs the world economy now, is our attention. But one of the shadow effects, one of the symptoms, has to do with the distractibility and loss of focus. And I find Johann Hari, his book Stolen Focus, it's more journalistic than psychological, but he's drilling down into a lot of interesting psychological material. The other book that I think underscores this problem of human commodification, I would say one of the most important books this century is the book by Shoshana Zuboff called Surveillance Capitalism. She's an economist, and she really takes an incredibly close look at the way tech corporations are using our personal information really without our conscious awareness. And then another book that impressed me, part of the problem of horizontality is that every fact is now met by a counterfact, and opinions seem to be all on the same level. So someone who has a big internet presence but may not know anything about anything over here is able to directly compete with the the expert, the person who spent half their life researching the topic over here. And this is a breakdown of what Jonathan Rauch calls the constitution of knowledge, that there used to be, before the age of the internet, a greater system of checks and balances on the dissemination of knowledge. You know, and a little more of a tendency to turn to expertise. In other words, a capacity to sort things on the vertical level. This is part of this, to me, this lost verticality. So this is important, and of course, you know, I don't know how many of you are here in America and elsewhere, but this this is perhaps the major factor in the fact that less than 2 weeks from now, half of America is going to vote for Donald Trump. And surely for all the other reasons, there's got to be the reason of people just not being able to sift through the material in a viable way. So the counter to this idea of technology just being neutral in the digital age would be the understanding that what's really going on is social engineering. And it didn't start with the digital age. I mean, one of my favorite go-to authors is Theodore Roszak, and he, in his book, The Making of a Counterculture, he writes, "We arrive at the era of social engineering in which entrepreneurial talent broadens its province to orchestrate the total human context which surrounds the industrial complex." Wow. So if just that was remotely true in 1969, we have to think about what entrepreneurial talent is doing in very obvious and sometimes not so obvious ways to the total human context now. And to me, the problem at technology companies has to do with the problem of specialization. Everyone has their head down in their own little bit and doing their thing, but there aren't people that are stepping all the way back and saying, well, what is happening on a psychosocial level? What are the implications of this? And if they do, as in, you know, the way, for example, Facebook studied the impact of social media on young women, and then it just quashed it. It's like, well, this doesn't fit in with our narrative or the way we want to present the world, so we'll just put that aside. The humanities has to come back somehow. It has to come back in, and maybe depth psychological sensibility will happen in order to offset this. And I have to, there's a part of my book where I give in. I allow myself to explore this idea, a bit irreverent. You know, are we really dealing with the revenge of the nerds? Is it that these technologists, many of whom have grown up in a very just purely leaning on the intellect, very disembodied, very socially awkward, feeling disconnected, are we suffering from their complex of wanting to just dominate and take over the world and turn the world into a mirror of the way their own psyches tend to work. I think we have to think about this. And a great ally I found along these lines is the tech writer Jaron Lanier. He was actually instrumental in the developing of virtual reality technologies, but he's become a fierce critic of the tech industry. And he writes in his book, "You Are Not a Gadget." It is impossible to work with information technology without also engaging in social engineering. We make up extensions of your being like remote eyes and ears, webcams and mobile phones, and expanded memory. World of details you can search online. These become the structures by which you connect to the world and other people. These structures in turn can change how you conceive of yourself in the world. We tinker with your philosophy by direct manipulation of your cognitive experience, not indirectly through argument. See, there's that idea of manipulation, except it's we that are being manipulated. We tinker with your philosophy by direct manipulation of your cognitive experience. And, the structures are really algorithmically derived, not archetypally derived. So now we come to the topic of dissociation, which I think is a critical dynamic in not realizing what is happening to us, not realizing what is going on in our immersion in the technosphere. I think we are like the slowly boiling frog, and the fact that there's no wake up call, there's no sudden consciousness of whoa, let's see what's happening, but more than that, like to feel what's happening. That, and I wonder, and I'd like to hear from you about this. I wonder if this is arguably the most prevalent form of psychopathology today. And of course, it has a spectrum of severity. But the main thing about dissociation is that it's opposed to integration. And if you don't have integration, you don't have consciousness, right? Dissociation, the idea goes back to Pierre Genet, and then Jung picked it up. Jung, of course, saw dissociation as fairly much a part of psychological life, that psyche naturally dissociated into the complexes and so forth. And it's only problematic when the dissociation gets to the point of parts of the psyche becoming autonomous, and so that the integrative forces are not really imbalanced. But it shows up. I mean, the symptom of if dissociation is a psychodynamic, its affective symptomatology has to do with the numbing. And in general parlance, it's referred to as emotional detachment. So in my book, I write that it presents an unfeeling way of relating to oneself and engaging the world. Contact with a sense of self and living fullness of existence is then lost. A stunting of development and disruption of integrative processes that generate meaning and sustain culture ensues. And to me, what's shifted, what's changed from the industrial age to the post-industrial age is this horizonality, if you will, the stretching of our consciousness, the overwhelming amount of input and information and stimulation, which leads to a sort of style of compartmentalization. And my argument, which goes back to paper that Ipek mentioned that I wrote back in 2008 called Numb, is that dissociation in the classical era of depth psychology was a sort of fragmentation of the vertical axis, right? Things were repressed and suppressed and so forth. But now I think I'd like to suggest to you is that we're dissociating from verticality altogether. That understanding things, that developing a feeling life, that having a vital imagination, that these are things that people are really have discarded or split off from, or that they're no longer important. So I say emotion is thereby prevented from metabolizing into feeling, closing down the pathways by which a person consciously suffers or a group digests historical traumas or societal breakdowns. You know, and we all remember that in a way was the aim of Jung's psychotherapy, to help people move from neurotic suffering to conscious suffering. But in order to suffer consciously, we have to feel these divisions. We have to feel the tension, for example, between the horizontal and the vertical. And then, as we've mentioned, the darker implication, the split off portions of the psyche becoming more autonomous. And I think we see this with addiction. The spiritual longing gets split off or not attended to, turns into addiction. The need for community turns into the hive mind and online tribalism. The need for, as we were talking about, a sense of meaning, purpose, a connection to the whole becomes forms of fanaticism. And then the paranoia, the dark hole that's out there, that's always seems to be impinging upon us. To me, these are symptoms of splitting off from this vertical axis. So as I write about this in the book, say pervading psychological life in the post-industrial era, dissociation and numbing appear deeply implicated in the pursuit of an even more complete departure from ourselves, particularly from the body-mind connections involved in the felt sense of who and what we are. Many end up doggedly pursuing states of perfection, right? And transcendence, finding ways to just rise above it all or get beyond it all, which we see in the therapy room, I'm sure, which are often compensatory calling cards of disintegrating minds. In other words, this is not a conscious engagement with the fragmentation. This is a way to get beyond it. As Wilhelm Flusser has written, we throw ourselves towards transcendence in the same way we throw ourselves toward interplanetary space in order to escape the abyss that is opened underneath the ground we tread. This abyss is, in essence, the growing unfamiliarity with ourselves, and it is this abyss that becomes the womb of the fabricated self. So what I'm arguing here is that to the degree I'm describing something that's a phenomenon, this is like preparing the ground for the literal departure from ourselves, the psychological departure followed by the actual departure. Now, I found a great ally in a lot of my thinking in the writings of the French philosopher Jean Baudrillard, and he describes to me, my reading is a similar thing. He talks about the widespread indifference. He says the indifference to oneself is at the heart of the more general problem of indifference of institutions or of the political. Such indifference, he suggests, results from the absence of division within the subject. I'm missing a little beginning quote, opening quote, but he uses this phrase, the absence of division within the subject, by which I take to mean is the absence of a consciousness of the division. And instead, we find what he describes as a horizontal madness, our specific delirium and that of our culture, the delirium of genetic confusion, the scrambling of codes and networks of biological and molecular anomalies. In other words, it's a sort of image of not having a ground of being, not being able to trust things, everything is in sort of flow and chaos and so forth. So I take all this, and where I head is to say, by implication, dissociation is diminishing our recognition of the deeply human and ability to sustain vertical modes of understanding. The resulting psychic numbing is ensuring we do not feel parts of our humanity being amputated to make way for prosthetic bodies and minds. Dissociated and numb in relation to being, we're thus more enticed into the possibilities of becoming. Being versus becoming. In the absence of a more substantive psychological bearing, an absent fullness of living itself, a phrase that William James used as a sort of goal of life, the fullness of living itself, technological frontierism will likely fill the entire horizon. I mean, this is my concern, is not to stop technology, but to mitigate it by bringing in other values, by other factors. It is in these ways, though, that dissociation and numbing lie at the very heart of our collapsing ecology of mind. Now, there's a couple more things I'm not going to go into for the sake of time, but in amplifying this, there's a piece that Hillman wrote called Hermetic Intoxication, which I think conveys well this horizontality of the internet. And he was seeing this, he wrote this piece back in 1996. And he talks about, for example, Hermes being an indiscriminate messenger. You know, one of Hillman's favorite phrases was that he took from a writer, his name I forgot, is that the gods never appear alone. And of course, Hermes and Hestia often appear together in Greek iconography. And that's because Hestia, in a way, represents the stable. She represents the vertical, the circular, and Hillman argues that that's what's split off in the information age. Is this Hestian sort of ability to sort of stand in place. I often think about this as what plays out in most every household when someone's online doing something and dinner is ready. You know, the Hestian practice of sitting around the dinner table, the hearth of the house, while the kind of siren call of the internet or the game or whatever it is going on in the background. Well, this to me is the Hermes Hestia collision. But in something else that I wrote, including in my book, I also point out that the fixation on Hermes forgets the part of Hermes that has to do with interpretation, with understanding, with hermeneutics. right? Which also is a practice of connecting the parts in the whole. So that would be another way of amplifying this. I'd also like to refer you to the really important book written in 1993 by Robert J. Lifton, who is really the world expert on totalistic psychology, totalistic societies, cults, and so forth. He puts forward the idea that there is a creative response to this sort of age of fragmentation, and that's to create a protean self that's able to sort of go with the fluidity and flexibility, be a kind of jack of all trades. But he said the shadow of this for people who can't manage to do it is the falling into the dissociative, which then is compensated by these like falling into fundamentalisms, for example, or falling into political ideologies that people find pseudo totalities, right, to compensate for the underlying fragmentation. I feel it's a very important and compelling hypothesis. Now, where Jungian psychology comes in, of course, is the value and the processes of integration. How do we integrate these unconscious pieces with consciousness? And I don't need to go into that, but in Collected Work 17, Jung says something very curious. A dissociation is not healed by being split off, but by more complete disintegration. Now, to me, that's something to really think about and meditate on, because the way I take it is that Jung's saying there's no integration without being more conscious of the parts, without sort of experiencing the tension of opposites, without seeing the way in which we're falling apart, and that's what precedes the integration. And to me, of course, this goes back to a sense of the sacred and just the whole recovery, right, of the vertical. I don't think we can go vertical unless we're prepared to put our surface experiences together to really ground ourselves in the what is of what's happening. Okay, this is very short, the third part, and that will bring us to conclusion. We'll be able to have some discussion. I spend 3 parts of the book basically setting out the essential problem that I see in the spirit of that idea from Jung just now, that we need to understand where we're being pulled, to become more conscious of that in order to pivot in another direction. So that's primary, experiencing the inner division. I think also somehow realizing that accounting for the shadow is critical, that civilization itself casts a shadow, and that to maintain the relationship between nature, which of course is dark and light, creative, destructive on the one hand, and civilization on the other, which tends to move more towards order and perfection, that if there's going to be a viable relationship, that the keeping a sense of the shadow is key to that. I mean, among other things, I think what that does is it just mitigates it quote Larry David, curbs our enthusiasm. It just makes us pause a little bit, and think about this, and particularly if we're on the verge of having the power to change this one experiment in conscious existence in one small corner of the universe, that surely we need to take as much into account as possible. But in the ultimate sense too, I feel very aligned with Jung's view of Western history, which is that we spent 2,000 years sort of focused on this spiritual, this verticality, but in a sort of upward thrusting direction. Then the Renaissance came along, the Enlightenment, all of this sort of exploration and explosion of knowledge and scientific understanding. And the challenge in the modern era was to bring the horizontal and the vertical together. Obviously, Jung saw the essence of that in terms of the collision between spirit and matter, or the challenge to integrate spirit and matter. And there's a lot of books that have been written on posthumanism and transhumanism that suggest that there's a underlying spiritual thrust. But of course, as we know from depth psychology, if we have just the spirit and not the soul and not the underworld, that's not going to go well. And that, I think, is another way of looking at the problem. So again, I mean, to me, the posthuman trajectory is very much diametrically opposed to what Jung saw as the task of Western history. Maybe the sensibilities of depth psychology, particularly the sensibilities around more holistic thinking, which ironically Jung was talking about psychologically before they became important biologically or ecologically. But now it seems like we need to somehow circle back around. That it's not a matter of converting the masses to depth psychological thinking, but the principle of taking the unknown into account, of having more reverence for the mysterious, and for realizing that there is an inner ecology in some way, that these base notes of depth psychology seem to me absolutely vital in terms of turning the corner with this. And as I mentioned earlier, the ability to see symptoms as symptoms. I mean, so much of the technosphere now looks at both physical and psychological symptoms and goes immediately to the solution without reading, what kind of commentary is going on here on the digital lifestyle. And this seems to me just a matter of sort of joining the dots. So of course, we're talking about a soul-centered perspective as a kind of counter to that reductionistic thinking. Your depression is a neurological imbalance or chemical imbalance and so on. The artists generally get there before the psychologists, and Heidegger's thesis was, going back to that original root of techne, that it would be the elevation of the artistic sensibility, so that it could be placed alongside the technological propensity. And of course, we can expand that into symbolic thinking, the cultural imagination, and so forth. That this is what would enable us to sort of move through the time in a more conducive way. And Jung, as we know, talked about visionary art. He said, whenever the collective unconscious becomes a living experience, It's brought to bear upon the conscious outlook of the age. This event is a creative act, which is of importance for a whole epoch. And my way of thinking, particularly about apocalyptic cinema or sci-fi cinema, is that these are cultural warning dreams, and that actually we need ways to digest what these things are saying to us. My read of history is that history moves in arcs, and that part of like making these little turns and adjustments is that we have these visionaries, artists, writers, filmmakers, who extrapolate from the present. They say, oh, this is where we're headed. This is what the world's going to be like in 30, 40, 50 years if we don't do anything. And our job, particularly as depth psychologists, is to look at these things and digest them, and say, oh, okay, just like we work with a dream, and that shifts our attitude a little bit. So I'm a big believer in that practice. So how do we then, the essence of what I've been presenting to you would be, we could say, moving from the algorithmic to the archetypal. I think we need a new version of resistance to the mass mind, as Jung described it in his writings. It would be resistance to the ill effects of the online world. Yuval Harari, I mentioned earlier, at the end of his book Homo Deus, which treats a lot of these ideas, he's a huge advocate for meditation, because he thinks that if we can be more conscious in that way, we won't be sucked up by the technocracy. We've talked about the interconnected ecological character of interiority, taking into mind the compensatory dynamics. In a paper on Titanism that is called And Huge is Ugly, it's in the Mythic Figures volume, Hillman says the solution to this sort of giantism of the culture is simple return to our senses, taste and see. Just to become more alive in relationship to the world. And to me, that's probably the essential medicine for the dissociation. And as we know from Jung, we have to deal with these archetypes one way or another. So to conclude, Rosak's, he coined the term counterculture, and I have to wonder, and I'd be interested to hear from you, is there a possibility for a new counterculture? Rosak made the argument that the essence of the first counterculture of the 60s and 70s was a reaction to technocracy. That when you peeled off all of the interest in altered states and consciousness and connecting to other people and so forth, that this is what you're getting. Hillman, if you're interested, also addresses this counterculture at the beginning of his long essay on Senex and Puer. The question that haunts me is, what is going to guide us? And is it possible that there could be a co-creative ethos where we listen to a deeper form of intelligence? We know what that means in the Jungian context, but is there a way to generate a sense of that more broadly? That just as we've learned that nature has its own intelligence that orchestrates the outer ecology, what would it mean to find that for the inner ecology? Consciousness is is key. I don't see a viable way forward without consciousness, which is different from intelligence. The technologists see the increase of intelligence as central. Somehow that's got to be balanced with the increase in consciousness. So I've realized gone a few minutes over, but thank you. So let's stop there and hopefully have some discussion.
Thank you, Glenn. Thank you so much. That was an incredibly rich presentation. I mean, I was feverishly taking notes. I don't know how many pages I filled up here, but I think you conveyed very powerfully the urgency of this inquiry, really, understanding what is at stake. And, you know, it's wonderful to be able to give it this in-depth reflection as a group of the psychologists. And then again, we are a small group in the world, it feels like. So I feel the weight of that as well. I would invite everyone to ask questions, share your comments, whatever is maybe what resonated with you, what's haunting you, what's inspiring you. You can just raise your hand and I will unmute you. Or you can also use the chat function if you would like to write down your thoughts. And if I can start the process if you'd like. One of the things that's really coming up for me, I realized as I was listening to you in terms of dissociation adaptation, I kept coming to the body embodiment and disembodiment that comes with. I mean, it was really striking, that example of the digital natives choosing their hand being broken rather than their phone getting lost, for instance. I mean, I know it's an exaggerated example. At the same time, how the body is just almost disappearing in this context, or like people are using technology to track their bodies, but you know, their steps and sleep and calories, whatnot. But even in that, I sense the disconnect rather than feeling into your body, getting into your body, relying on the technologies. Now there's some talk about how technology is changing our posture, literally, right? Like caving in our shoulders. And I've read at one point somewhere about thumbs, right? We're using so much our hands and thumbs in particular in the human bodily evolution. Where is that going to lead? So all these things are very fascinating to me. I'm just basically sharing my reflections and would love to hear from you about that. Also, like the vertical, you mentioned the root system, right? There's a root system in the vertical with the great tree. So how are we rooted, can be rooted into the earth in this time when it's like cyber versus body in a way?
Yeah, that's great, because I do think the relationship to the body is at the center of this dissociative dynamic and this psychic numbing. And we all know the experience of hopping online to research a question that we think will take 5 or 10 minutes, and 2 hours later it's like we've been lost going down the rabbit warren. And what has happened to the other aspects of our life and our bodily feeling during that time? But I think even at another level, for a lot of digital natives in particular, their sense of self has moved online. It's on their social media page. And I suppose in Jungian psychology, we'd look at that as the persona field. But if you have a healthy persona field, it's in relationship to the ego and hopefully ultimately the shadow and so forth. But that the pressures to create a sort of perfect social media presence, I think right there's a sort of split from a sense of self that is more at home in the body and the way the body is. Apparently, there's a trend now in cosmetic surgery where people are getting bodily changes so that they appear better in their online presence, right, rather than in their actual in the world presence. Um, so so that's interesting, but also I think if we just go outside and look around, we talk about the body as such, but the phenomenologist would remind us that the body is always a body in relationship to the world. It's always a body in context. But just think about the way in which we are so often now not in the world because of the attachment to our devices. And I heard recently a discussion with people who realized that they could go for a walk without without their cell phone, and they were describing this sort of revelation of what it was like to just go for a 10 or 15-minute walk and leave their phone behind, and all of the things that they started to notice and then to think about. And it does seem as though there's a backlash in that way, and that a lot of people are having vacations from their devices and trying to build that in. So perhaps that will happen. Perhaps there'll be a recovery of this more embodied, way of being present to ourselves and things. I'm not sure, but I don't have a list of handy tips. I'm I'm more sort of eyeing the problem at this point.
Thank you, Glenn. And we have two questions in the chat that I will share with you. We have about 15 minutes, so we're just going to be mindful of time. And first question comes from Marilyn DeMario. She says, could you say something more about the sense of sacredness, which you mentioned?
Yeah. This is a big one for me. I did my doctoral thesis on the relationship between hubris and sacrifice, and the way those patterns come together in the myth of Prometheus, because we all know the Promethean impulse is related to the modern technological world, and cultural commentators have been using that pattern in that regard. But people tend to forget that part of the Promethean story was he was asked by Zeus to invent a sacrifice, and the word sacrifice just means to make sacred, and essentially, whereas hubris is sort of turning our backs on the gods, sacrifice is turning our attention towards the gods, to remembering the gods. And my thesis there was that we now live in a culture that has very little sacrificial consciousness, either in a ritual form or in the form of just philosophy of life and so forth. And then, to me, that then unleashes the hubristic side, one of the common themes that comes up in the writing on posthumanism, whether it's enthusiastic or critical, is that now we are the gods. We are the gods, and there's a sense in which that's really true. This power that we have over creation, and now over ourselves, and so to me, this just really underscores the importance of finding a connection to the sacred, both attitudinally, sort of some awareness of the otherness, some sense of being informed by something beyond our own genius, both individually and collectively. But how does that come in? I think I think the most viable way is through the cultural imagination. That the relationship to the gods is in a way there in the background of all artistic offerings. Isn't that what art really does? Isn't it taking our awareness back to the archetypal world in one way or another? Maybe not made explicit, or to the enduring values, the universals. So I mean, there's some thoughts on that to expand the idea, and of course, people talk today about the spiritual search and so forth. But I just wonder how successful, in many circles, it's more of an ego accessory than a deep commitment to that deeper intelligence that I was talking about. That somehow we need a relationship to that other center of gravity. Some thoughts, yeah.
Yeah, very thought-provoking. Thank you so much. We're going to have a lot to unpack after this presentation, all of us, I feel like. There is another question. I loved your presentation and your book. I have a question. I agree on your description of dissociation numbness, but what if this, what we unconsciously looking for? In a society increasingly characterized by narcissism, where individuals are pressured to present the best version of themselves and be completely understood by others, is the development of AI and technological tinkering a response to an underlying incapacity to support otherness? Could it be that delegating the role of the other to machines is a way of managing the impossibility of true understanding, as it is perversely easier to face humiliation or rejection from an AI than from a human counterpart? How does this reflect our broader discomfort with vulnerability and imperfection in interpersonal relationships and patch our narcissism?
Well, I think it's a great question, and a lot of, to me, the answer to the question is in the question. The putting the finger on the trouble, because surely we could say on the spectrum of dissociation that narcissism is a form of extreme dissociation. It's a dissociation from the authentic self, and instead the creation of a compensatory, typically grandiose, but always false self. So in a way, it is a pattern that surely plays into this collective idea of perfecting ourselves through technology, creating better and better versions of ourselves in that way, while leaving behind what is more authentic and as this person is saying towards the end of the question, flawed, full of imperfections. I mean, surely the relationship with our imperfection is the beginning of our relationship with the shadow, and then with nature, and with the instinctual world. That is the way back. I've got a chapter in my book on psychopathy, which of course pushes narcissism that one step further, and that's almost a complete dissociation from humanness itself, and the development of a really impenetrable kind of almost anti-human personality structure. And I think, one of the things that even the gung-ho technologists are worried about is whether the AI could turn out to be psychopathic, and there's a good probability it will, because there's no one home. There is no entity, and there's no understanding going on in AI. AI is a fabrication. It's a fabrication of personality or presence, and I think one of the great tasks ahead of us is for us all to remember that in our interactions with AI. But anyway, some thoughts, but thanks for the rich question.
Indeed, rich question for such a rich presentation. I feel like it's humbling, right? So it's the hubris and also our human vulnerability. I was really touched when you said, like, we're a small corner of the universe, suddenly putting us in place. That to imagine that, how small we are in the face of it all. Actually, it's overwhelming in a way, but also humbling in a good way. So if anybody else has a comment or a question, please join in right now. And if not, I will bring this to a closure. I'm going to wait for just another second. Oh, Kathy has. 1 second. I didn't see a hand up. Let me see. Well, I'm going to unmute you, Kathy. 1 second. Can I unmute you? I'm asking to unmute you if you can. Yeah. No, it didn't work. I'm sorry. 1 second. Let me try this again. I'm going to do something different. I'm going to try to make you a co-host, and that way I think you will have control of your. Can you unmute yourself now? No.
Okay. Well, you know, we could, sorry, Kathy, but you know, what you ended with there, Ipek, ultimately, we need a cosmology, don't we? We need a sense of human destiny in relationship to a cosmological vision. And without that, we're much more apt just to go along with technological innovation as it appears. I mean, and surely that is a humbling idea, right? That maybe we're the only experiment in conscious life in the universe. Maybe there's other forms of life we don't know, but some of the hard posthumanists, one of the people instrumental in developing the mind as computer understanding was John van Neumann, and he came up with an idea that's now called the von Neumann probe, and this would be to have a self-replicating computerized intelligence that's sent off into space and then just slowly starts to populate the solar system, and then with whatever the residual of human consciousness is, with whatever species emerges from this human machine. And if you combine that idea with nanotechnology, which is changing matter at the molecular level, then you get this notion of something going out into the universe and just changing everything into sort of giant computer, right? That the universe itself becomes just a form of intelligence. But I mean, without consciousness, without conscious life of some kind, what does that mean? What's the significance of something like that? Does it really? And if in fact we think, well, that is our destiny, that's no destiny. That's not a destiny, because we no longer have a hand in the sense of purpose and meaning. So I do think this topic opens up into some rather big big questions that I hope we all start thinking about and wrestling with. And so I appreciate everyone coming, and thank you.
Thank you, Glenn. What a beautiful, thoughtful way to actually bring it to a closure. We're going to continue wrestling, and James Hillman had that saying, wrestling with ideas is like wrestling with angels. It's a sacred struggle, and we're in this as a sacred struggle. And thank you so much for sharing everything with us. This book, once again, is amazing. Highly recommended. If you have any questions, like Kathy, who couldn't share it right now, you have my email address. You can reach out to me and I will share those with Glenn. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful weekend.
Thanks,
Bye.
Ipek. Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.